Welcome everybody to supplementary video covering sections 13.2 and 13.3. Most of this video is going to talk about blood flow within the cerebrum, but there were a few more subcortical structures that I did want to mention, so that's why I threw them in here from 13.2. But most of this video is going to talk about 13.3 and blood flow. So we'll start off with 13.2, some subcortical structures here. Much of your higher functions are going to be due to your cerebrum. That's kind of what separates us from a lot of other animals and other organisms and things like that, is just how complex our cerebrum is. But deep within the cerebrum, we do have three important functional groups that are going to play some pretty important roles. So we start off with the basal nuclei. That's going to include things the caudate, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. They're going to be responsible for some cognitive processing. So thinking and processing what you're thinking about, such as planning your movements. The basal forebrain is going to be responsible for learning and memory, and it's also going to produce acetylcholine. The hippocampus and the amygdala are in association with the limbic cortex, which obviously is going to be on the cortex of the cerebrum. But the hippocampus and amygdala are going to play roles in emotion, memory, and behavior. So those structures are very deep here. This one I'm just focusing on the caudate, putamen, and globus pallidus here. But you can see they are very deep structures. You have the cortex around the outside here of your cerebrum. But those are just some important structures to know what their functions are. Okay, getting to blood supply, it's going to start with your heart is going to be pumping oxygenated blood. It's going to pass through the aorta. You're going to have branches off of the aorta called the common carotid arteries, and then off the common carotid arteries, you're going to have branches called the internal carotid arteries. You do have external carotid arteries as well, but we're going to focus on the internal carotid arteries here. Internal carotid arteries are going to enter the cranium through the carotid canal in your temporal bone. You're also going to have vertebral arteries passing through the transverse foramina of your cervical vertebrae. Remember, that's what makes those cervical vertebrae special, is they have those transverse foramina. Vertebral arteries are passing through them, and then those vertebral arteries will actually enter through the cranium through the foramen magnum. Remember that big hole at the base of the skull. Excuse me. Branches are going to merge into the anterior spinal artery of the the vertebral arteries will branch to, and some of those branches will merge into the anterior spinal artery, which is going to be responsible for feeding the anterior spinal cord. The rest of the vertebral arteries will then fuse together into what's called the basilar artery, which is going to feed the brainstem and the cerebellum. Internal carotid arteries and the basilar artery together are going to form what's called the circle of Willis, which we have here. And that circle of Willis is really important because it is the circle, and you can kind of see how blood flow is able to move around here. If any one of these parts is pinched off, blood flow is still able to pass through in a different direction and still get to all the structures that need blood. So the circle of Willis, the reason it's pointed out is because it allows blood to still get to all of the different structures of the brain and of the spinal cord here, even if one part is pinched off, because it is able to move and take a longer route, but still get there. Venous return. So once that arterial blood is flowed through the central nervous system, it's going to run back to the heart through a series of dural sinuses and veins, starting with the superior sagittal sinus. It's going to be absorbing cerebrospinal fluid from your meninges before it joins up with the occipital sinus and the straight sinus at what's called the confluence of sinuses. We'll see a picture of all this here in a minute. The confluence of sinuses are going to drain into the transverse sinuses, and then those transverse sinuses will join up with the sigmoid sinuses, which then connects to your jugular veins, and then those jugular veins are going to be flowing back to the superior vena cava and back to the heart. So you can see here we have the superior sagittal sinus. So there's nice arrows here pointing out the direction that this blood is flowing on its way back to the heart. Here's your confluence of sinuses here, where you have the occipital sinus joining back, as well as this would be the greater cerebral vein. Yep, there we go. But that confluence of sinuses, where all those sinuses are joining up, and then it's going to flow through this transverse sinus and eventually get back to the jugular vein via the sigmoid sinus. So that is blood flow, the arterial flow, starting on the base of the skull, and then flowing back through the venous return. That's those sinuses and those venuses. It's very important to know that with blood flow, the brain is very controlling at what is able to enter or exit the brain, and through that blood-brain barrier. So very few things are able to make it through. Oxygen and glucose are really important to make sure that your brain is getting, and that's why the circle of Willis is really important. If you have any sort of damage and pinched off any of those arteries, you're able to still get blood flow to your brain because the brain uses something like 30% of all of your energy. So the more you're thinking, the more energy you're burning. So maybe that can be helpful for some of you. But then here, the reason you have these sinuses and the picking up cerebrospinal fluid from the meninges is because you don't actually want blood on the brain like you have happened with a stroke. And so you're going to have blood flow very close, but still separated from the brain here on its way back. Okay, so that's video 13.2 and 13.3.